This is the most effective killer the world has ever seen. It's not a weapon of war, but a speck of ordinary mold. Yet, its power is absolute. Before this mold was harnessed, our world was a far more dangerous place. Imagine a world where a simple scratch from a rose thorn could kill you, where a sore throat could lead to rheumatic fever and a damaged heart for life, where a surgeon, opening you up to save your life, knew the greatest danger wasn't the operation itself, but the rampant infection that would almost certainly follow. This was the reality for all of human history. We were in a losing war against an invisible enemy, bacteria. And then, in 1928, a miracle. A lucky accident in the lab of this man, Alexander Fleming. The discovery of penicillin. He's the hero of the story, the name in every textbook. But what if I told you the man who discovered the miracle couldn't make it work? That he published his findings, and then, for 10 years, the world's most important medicine sat on a shelf, forgotten. The people who really saved the world are the ones you've never heard of. Our story picks up a decade later, in this building, the Sir William Dunn School of Pathology at Oxford. It's 1939. Britain is on the brink of another catastrophic war. Blackout curtains are being fitted, and the university's men are preparing to enlist. Inside, a team of researchers knows that the coming conflict will be fought not just on the battlefield, but in the field hospital. They begin a systematic search, digging through old, forgotten scientific papers for anything that might kill bacteria. The team was led by an unlikely pair. Howard Florey, an Australian pathologist, was the stoic, relentless leader. A brilliant project manager who knew how to assemble talent and secure funding, even when there was none. His lead biochemist was Ernst, a fiery, temperamental genius, and a Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany just years before. He was driven by a fierce intellect and the knowledge of what was happening to his people back home. They were the engine of the operation, and they stumbled upon Fleming's 10-year-old paper. They saw the potential that Fleming had missed. To understand what they were up against, you have to understand Fleming's story. He was a brilliant bacteriologist, but a notoriously untidy one. In September 1928, he returned from holiday to find a stack of petri dishes he'd forgotten to clean. On one, a speck of mold was growing, but something was different. Everywhere else on the plate, Staphylococcus bacteria grew in cloudy colonies. But in a clear circle around the mold, the bacteria were dead, transparent, as if they'd been dissolved. He correctly identified the mold as Penicillium notatum and named its bacteria-killing juice penicillin. He published a paper on it in 1929, noting its potential. But he was a bacteriologist, not a chemist. He couldn't solve the critical problem. The substance was incredibly unstable. It lost its potency within hours. He couldn't purify it, and he couldn't produce more than a tiny amount. After a few frustrating attempts, he moved on. For 10 years, the most important medical discovery of the century sat on a shelf, a scientific curiosity. It's hard for us to grasp what was at stake. A world without antibiotics was a world where childbirth was a leading cause of death for young women, where common diseases of childhood, strep throat, scarlet fever, meningitis, were death sentences. In the coming war, they knew that for every soldier killed by a bullet, at least 2 more would die later from infection in the wound. Conquering this challenge wasn't just about fame, it was about changing the very nature of human existence. It meant that for the first time, doctors wouldn't just be managing a patient's decline, they could actively cure them. The team at Oxford knew this, and under Florey's determined leadership, they began the painstaking work of trying to tame Fleming's mold. So, how did they succeed where Fleming failed? With sheer, unglamorous, back-breaking work. While the Blitz raged over Britain, the Oxford team turned their entire lab into a penicillin factory. Their budget was laughably small. They needed to grow gallons of the mold, so they used anything they could find. Ceramic bedpans, biscuit tins, old bathtubs. They hired a small team of penicillin girls to culture the mold and extract the precious fluid. It was a smelly, difficult, and repetitive process. The key breakthrough came from another unsung hero, biochemist Norman Heatley. He devised a brilliant counter-current extraction method to finally purify and stabilize a small amount of penicillin powder. It was tedious and complex, but it worked. After nearly 2 years of relentless effort, they finally had enough of the precious yellow powder for a definitive test. On May 25, 1940, they were ready. They infected 8 mice with a lethal dose of streptococcus. 4 were left as a control group. 4 were given injections of their new penicillin powder. Florey and Chain waited anxiously. The next morning, the result was unambiguous. The 4 untreated mice were dead. The 4 that received penicillin were perfectly healthy. Chain supposedly danced around the lab. They had done it. They had proven it worked in a living animal. Now came the ultimate test, a human patient. This is Albert Alexander, a 43-year-old policeman. He was dying. A simple scratch on his face from a rosebush had become a horrific systemic infection. Abscesses covered his head. He'd had an eye removed. His body was racked with fever. He was days from death. On February 12, 1941, they began injecting him with their entire supply of penicillin. The result was miraculous. Within 24 hours, his fever dropped. The infection began to recede. He was recovering. But the team watched in horror as their tiny stock of the yellow powder dwindled. The yield from the mold was so poor that they were literally collecting Alexander's urine, taking it back to the lab, and re-extracting the unmetabolized penicillin from it to re-inject into him. It wasn't enough. After 5 days, they ran out. The infection returned with a vengeance, and Albert Alexander died. It was a tragic, brutal lesson. The miracle worked, but they couldn't make enough of it. With Britain straining under the war, Florey knew they needed industrial-scale help. In the summer of 1941, he and Norman Heatley took the incredible risk of traveling to the neutral United States, carrying spores of the precious mold in the linings of their coats. They begged and pleaded with American labs and government officials, who were skeptical. But eventually, they convinced a government lab in Peoria, Illinois, to take on the challenge. American scientists found a more productive strain of the mold on a cantaloupe and developed deep tank fermentation methods. Production exploded. By D-Day in 1944, there was enough penicillin to treat every single wounded Allied soldier. The effect was staggering. In World War I, the death rate from bacterial pneumonia was 18%. In World War II, with penicillin, it fell to less than 1%. Amputations became rare. Soldiers were surviving wounds that would have been an absolute death sentence just 5 years earlier. The tide of the medical war had turned, thanks to the team at Oxford and their American partners. Fleming, Florey, and Chain shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1945. But history and the press loved the simpler story of the lone genius and his lucky accident. Fleming, who was a brilliant self-promoter, became a global celebrity. Florey, who hated the spotlight, returned to his lab work. And Chain, the fiery refugee who helped drive the biochemistry, was often overlooked. The quiet, essential Norman Heatley wasn't even included. Florey, Chain, and their team, the people who actually delivered the miracle, became footnotes. Their story is a powerful reminder that scientific breakthroughs are rarely a single eureka moment. They are a war, waged by dedicated teams in labs, fighting for every small victory against impossible odds. They are the true unsung heroes, whose only mistake was being second. History remembers the winners. We remember the rest. Subscribe for the stories you were never told.